Greetings, my name is David Hicks. Welcome back to Getting to Know Jesus Part 3B. I call it Part 3 and 3A and 3B because I want you to know the history. Both these parts cover the history of what happened from creation till the time that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. So, let's pick up from where we left off. We had talked about Adam and Eve, the very first man and woman, all the way down to Jacob. But let me back up just a little bit here. Let's start with Abram and Sarai, whose names were changed to Abraham and Sarah because I thank God for this because I really don't know how to pronounce Sarai. I'm guessing, but hey, Sarah, I can do. Anyway, God, if you remember, gave three great promises to Abram, later known as Abraham. That his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, basically the eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea, and that through his seed, all the nations on the earth would be blessed. The New Testament helps us understand that God was talking about Jesus, that through Abraham's descendant, Jesus, all nations on the earth will be blessed because anybody of any nation can be saved by putting their faith in Christ. Much more of that as we get to know Jesus. Now, Abraham and Sarah had two sons, sort of, because they had a son named Ishmael, but that wasn't through Sarah directly. Sarah gave her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and through her she had a son indirectly. Hagar was basically a surrogate mother, if you will, and Abraham had a son then named Ishmael, but God's promises didn't continue with him. They continued with Isaac. Isaac had twin sons, Esau and Jacob, but of those two, God didn't give his promises to Esau like he did Abraham. He gave them to Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. And afterwards, his descendants, they were known as Hebrews, more commonly known as Israelites later on, and then today, more commonly known as Jews. Now, Jacob had 12 sons. It's a long story. It's a complicated story. He had 4 wives. Again, long, complicated story. And it's actually pretty funny if you really get down to it, but I'll skip that for now. Here they are in the order that they were born. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. Now, of these 12 sons, Jacob loved Joseph the most. I'll spare you the details as to why. But he gave Joseph a coat of many colors. Not only this, in other words, it was a very fancy coat, expensive coat, that he didn't give to his other sons. It made it clear to the rest of his brothers who the favorite was. Not only that, Joseph had dreams, some special dreams that he told to his brothers that indicated, and his mother and dad, that indicated that someday they would all bow down to him. Now, if you have siblings, a brother or sister, and it is clearly evident that mom and dad love them more than you, and they come to you and they tell you they had a dream, seems like it's from God himself, indicating that you're going to bow down to them someday, how would you take it? They didn't take it well, as you can imagine. They hated Joseph. They were jealous of Joseph. And so one day, when they had opportunity, they took Joseph, threw him in a pit. They were out, to try and explain it, they were out wandering through the wilderness, taking care of sheep, taking care of their flocks. Joseph was sent to check up on them. And so when they had this opportunity away from their dad, they took Joseph. At first they wanted to kill him, but Reuben, the firstborn, said, no, don't kill him. Let's just throw him in this pit here, this empty well. And so that's what they did. And while Reuben was away, I tell you these so you can kind of see God's providence, God's moving through this story, his working. While Reuben was away, some Ishmaelite traders came along. And they said, hey, let's not kill Joseph, let's sell him. We can get some money off of it at least. So that's what they did. They sold Joseph to the Ishmaelite traders, and he became a slave in Egypt. Meanwhile, they took his coat of many colors, cut it up, dipped it in blood, took it back to their father and said, hey, isn't this Joseph's coat? And they made their father believe, they tricked him into believing that Joseph had been killed by wild animals, which broke Jacob's heart. Now Joseph, God blessed him in Egypt. And I say God blessed him, and yet at times it seems like God wasn't blessing him. Joseph was made a slave of a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar saw that everything Joseph did, God blessed. And so he put him in charge of his entire household. And yet one day, as it happened many times before, Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce Joseph. She was very attracted to Joseph, was wanting her to commit adultery. Was wanting him to commit adultery with her. Joseph refused. He knew God hated this. God, it would be abominable to God for him to do this, especially after he'd been so blessed by his own master. So he refused. So in this occasion, he ran away, and she grabbed his coat, tunic, whatever, and he just left it behind with her and just ran. That's how much Joseph wanted to obey the Lord. And so she was so mad, so enraged by his constant rejection, she screamed. Everybody came in, and she made up this story that Joseph had tried to seduce her, rape her, whatever. And so Joseph was thrown in jail. Now, that doesn't seem like God's being with Joseph and God's blessing Joseph. But the story continues. The jailer saw that everything Joseph did was blessed, and he put Joseph in charge of the prison. And during that time, two of Pharaoh's servants ended up in prison, a butler and a baker. They both had dreams. Joseph interpreted them both. The baker's dream, unfortunately, meant that he was going to be executed, and it happened. The butler's dream meant that he was going to serve Pharaoh again, and that happened. But when it happened, the butler forgot about Joseph. He was so excited, enamored with being back serving Pharaoh again, that he forgot to say anything about Joseph to Pharaoh. Well, Pharaoh had a dream about the meaning of which he didn't know at the time was that there was going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. But he couldn't understand that from the dream that he had had. There were 7 lean cows that ate 7 fat ones, 7 lean heads of grain that ate 7 fat ones. And so at that point, Butler's like, Joseph, I know a guy who can interpret dreams, Joseph. And so he recommended Joseph to Pharaoh. Pharaoh called him in. Joseph interpreted the dream. And Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph, not that just Joseph interpreted the dream, Joseph gave them a solution. He said, during the 7 years of plenty, store up food, and then you'll be okay during the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was so impressed that he put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. Joseph, the Hebrew, was second in command of all of Egypt. And so he did exactly what he said should be done. He stored up food during the 7 years of plenty, and then the 7 years of famine began. Well, the famine was also in the land of Canaan where Jacob's sons were living. And Jacob and his sons were living. So Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to get grain because he knew they could get grain from Egypt. So they came before Joseph, didn't even recognize him. It had been so long, but Joseph recognized them. And through a series of tests, Joseph finally decided to reveal himself to his brothers, had his entire family moved to Egypt so that he could save them during the 7 years of plenty. Well, just like God had promised. Oh, and I put Manasseh and Ephraim here because during that time, when Joseph interpreted this dream for Pharaoh, Pharaoh gave one of his, I think the daughter of a priest. It was either one of his own daughters or the daughter of a priest. I think it was the daughter of a priest. To Joseph as a wife, and through her he had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they get mentioned a lot in the Old Testament in case you be reading it and you're wondering who those 2 guys are. They're the sons of Joseph. Anyway, eventually the Israelites became so numerous in Egypt that the Egyptians were afraid of them, and they enslaved them. And during those years of hard bondage in Egypt, Moses was born. Moses was born at a time when the Egyptians were trying to conduct population control by having any son killed, any son executed. And so, any son born to the Hebrews, obviously. So when Moses was born, his parents hid him as long as they could. But when they couldn't hide him anymore, they put him in a basket. He floated down a river, floated down the Nile, was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And I guess that's what their hopes was, in putting him in the basket, that hopefully some Egyptian would find him and take care of him. I mean, roll the dice there. Better than that than just having him, seeing him slaughtered. So in a move of desperation, by God's providence, Pharaoh's daughter saw him, took him in, adopted him, raised him in the ways of the Egyptians, raised him among Pharaoh's sons. So Moses, when he grew older, felt like that, God had raised him up. I would need to get to the verses to show you the verses to indicate this. But based on what I've seen said about Moses in the New Testament, Moses felt like God had raised him up to save his people. He felt a calling. And I myself am adopted. And when you're adopted, I don't know if it's like this for every adopted child. It wasn't like this for me. I was adopted. I was raised by Christian parents. And so my thought was, why here? Why these parents? Why am I where I am? What's my purpose? And I felt like God had me where I was for a reason. Moses felt the same way. He was raised where he was, by who he was, for a reason. And he felt like that reason was to save his people. So one day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He took the Egyptian aside and in an act of rage, well, I don't know what you want to call it, act of war, I don't know. He killed the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew. Now he thought he got away with it in secret, but the next day he saw two Israelites getting in a fight, and they said, "Hey, who are you? Who made you a prince over us? You think you're going to kill one of us like you did the Egyptian the other day?" And then Moses knew he had been found out. Pharaoh found out about it. He wanted to kill Moses. Moses fled to the desert and was there for 40 years. One day while he was out in the desert, Moses saw a burning bush. It was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. It was like you see in movies where you see a person, a stunt man, he's on fire, but he's not actually being burned up. Of course, they have to put the fire out real quick. But this bush was just on fire, but nothing was happening to it. The leaves weren't changing color. It was an incredible sight. And so Moses approached, and during that time, God spoke to Moses, sent him back to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. Moses was very hesitant, to say the least, but eventually he obeyed. He went, and he and his brother Aaron confronted Pharaoh through 10 plagues. God convinced, if you will, finally, Pharaoh to let his people go. They left Egypt, went to the border of the Red Sea, and then God hardened Pharaoh's heart to come after him with his army to take them back to Egypt. But God saved his people by parting the Red Sea. They crossed over on dry ground, and when Pharaoh and his army tried to do the same, the waters closed in on them, and the Israelites were saved. From there they moved, God led them to a mountain, Mount Sinai. There he gave Moses his law, the 10 Commandments, among many other laws. He gave them instructions on building a tabernacle, a place of worship. He gave them instructions about the things that were to be in the tabernacle. He gave them instructions about building the Ark of the Covenant. And they did so in the wilderness. But as we'll see in our next segment, things did not go very well from there. Thank you for listening.